So our next speaker is Pamela Fox. She is not an Atlassian, like most of the people you've seen. She's one of our marquee speakers for this year, and she's an ex-Googler. She's worked on Google Maps, Google Wave, and you were in the Sydney office, right? And recently she's starting a new website called Eat Different, yeah? And a lot of other things about Pamela, like, you know, she graduated from USC, she was a computer engineering major, all kinds of cool stuff. But you know what? The best part about it is her talk. So I'm going to let her go ahead and give the talk. All right, thanks.
Cool. Hello, everyone. Woo, it's Kay. It's loud. Yeah, so with the hair, I do all my hair myself. So if any of you guys would like some low-cost hairstyling, hair dyeing, etc., just let me know. Pink, blue, all different colors. Maybe like an Atlassian color scheme. All right, so today I'm talking about developer experience. And this is very much a general topic for everyone in the development world. I don't actually use too many Atlassian products myself. I'll try and reference them when relevant. But it's really something that all of us experience, so I think it's worth talking about. But first of all, we have to figure out what developer experience is. So we've all heard about user experience, and I'm sure you've been to some talks, you know, at this conference about user experience, and everyone talks about it, and it's basically what it's like for a user to use a website or a product, right? Oh, I have this thingy. So we can break user experience down into these steps, especially for a website, right? Do I want to use it? How do I actually sign up? How do I start using it? Once I get past that first step, how do I continue using it to do what I want? And when shit happens, how do I get help? So to walk through here, I'm using the example of MailChimp. Any of you guys used MailChimp before? Yeah? It's pretty cool. I've signed up for it 3 times already, purely for the getting started experience. I've never actually done anything with it. I just think that they have this really nice experience, and I really like monkeys. Even though my last name is Fox, for some reason I collect monkeys until my ex-boyfriend threw them all away. So I have to use websites. So with MailChimp, you know, we go and we look in the front page, and it's got a giant happy monkey and then a giant thing which tells us what it is and a big sign up for free button. Yay. And then sign up is really simple. We just need a couple form fields, and it gives us nice happy confirmations along the way. And then once you want to get started, it's got this really simple 3 steps to getting started. And you're not very intimidated. You can just dive in and start making your first mailing list. And then when you go past there, then you've got more advanced help for figuring out how to use it to do those more complex things that you need. And then finally, we've got the standard forums and support when something goes wrong. So that's MailChimp, and they have a great user experience, all right? So what is a developer experience? The developer experience is just what it's like for a developer to be using a developer product, right? And we can actually break it into the exact same things. Do you want to use it? How do you sign up? How do you get started? How do you actually do what you want to do? And what happens when stuff goes wrong? So for an example of this, looking at Twilio. Anyone use Twilio? Yeah? So they're pretty cool. They've got this awesome SMS API. I tried it the other day, and I had something going in like 5 minutes, and it was awesome. So they've got a great experience. So when you go to the front page, it's really similar to MailChimp, where you've got a huge headline that tells you what it does and a giant get started for free button. Simple form for signing up, and these 3 steps for getting started. It actually looks remarkably similar to MailChimp. And then we've got a great reference stock and forum and support and phone and all that good stuff. So that's what developer experience is, what it's like to use a developer product. So you could maybe be asking yourself why you actually care. And that actually depends on who you are and whether you actually care. So in the world of developer tools and APIs, we have providers and we have consumers. So an example provider would be Atlassian, right? Particularly like Jira. So Atlassian is making all these developer tools, and they're making APIs to go along with these tools. And And so they're providing a developer experience. Then we have people that are consumers. So many plugin developers are actually consumers, right? You're consuming that Jira plugin API in order to make a plugin. And so, for example, Balsamiq, they have a Confluence plugin for making mockups. So they had to use the Confluence plugin API to do that. And then you have people that are both, right? So Lucidchart, I know they're here today, and they actually are a plugin, but they also provide an API of their own for people who want to interact with Lucidchart data. So actually, like when I look at most people these days in the world are both consumers and providers, because these days we're all kind of interdependent on each other. Like everybody is using an API for doing the stuff that they don't feel like doing themselves, and then pretty much everybody's exposing an API, right? Even when you're launching a startup, on day one, people look and they're like, what is this? There's no API, I'm leaving. Right? So pretty much everybody has to have an API, and we're all very dependent on other people's APIs or tools or whatever. So probably for most of you, you might be a little bit of both. But we'll do a survey. How many of you would say you're mostly on the provider side? Providers, okay. How many of you work for Atlassian? Okay, that was a direct correlation. Very good. You guys were there. And consumers. That's everyone else that doesn't work for Atlassian. Very good. So this is basically a conference put on by provider for all of its consumers. Now, who am I? So I started off when I was born as a consumer. I started using the Java as a little child to make little fun apps. And then I started using stuff in university, like the Amazon, Flickr, Google Maps API. And then I liked the Google Maps API so much, I decided just to start working on the Google Maps API team. So for the 5 years I was at Google, I was working on the provider side in developer relations, helping people understand how to use their APIs. So we were on the Google Maps API, and then the Google Wave API. And then I was even on Google Plus for a brief period until I decided to leave that forever. And now, for the last year, I've been just a consumer, right? I've just been hermit hacking in a co-working space, working with other people's APIs, and seeing what it's like to really be a developer on the outside. And it's really interesting because you actually have to deal with real bugs, and you can't just make demoware all the time. So I'm coming at it from both perspectives of seeing what it's like to be a provider, but also being a consumer. And that's why it matters to me. So why does developer experience actually matter, right? Can't you just put out a product and people will just use it? But here's the thing, right? When there's a bad developer experience, people are going to use the developer product as little as possible. They're going to use it to get the bare minimum integration that they need, and then they're just going to leave, right? And if there's some better alternative, then they're going to use that better alternative, right? So right now we have the Facebook API, which is, in my perspective, not a very good API. Anyone use the Facebook API? No, it's good that you haven't. There's a Facebook API, and right now with the Facebook API, you have to use it if you want access to the social graph, right? Because pretty much everybody's on Facebook, and everybody's mom and everybody's cat, and both of my cats are on Facebook. So you need it if you want to know whose people's cats are. But that means that even though the Facebook API has a really shitty developer experience, people are still using it because they have to. But if something comes along that's actually better, then I'm going to go and run to that as soon as I can, because I don't want to continue using something that's bad. So that means that it is possible one day that there might be something that challenges Facebook. It looks like it's not going to be Google+, but in case that does happen and that thing has a better experience, then everyone's going to rush to leave Facebook, because the only thing keeping them there is the fact that they have to use it to get that data. So if people don't have to use you and they have a bad experience, they're out of there. Now, on the other hand, if people have a really good developer experience, then they're going to start using you for more than they originally intended, right? They're going to be like, oh my God, that was so cool. Now I'm going to do this and this and this, right? And they're going to spend like Friday nights hacking and Saturday nights hacking, and then on Sunday they'll like launch a startup that's based on this, API. And so you get to see really cool stuff come out of the API, because people enjoyed using it so much. And then people will tell other people how much they liked it, and then you don't even have to have evangelists because everybody else is just spreading the word for you, right? So on the Maps API, I remember when I first used the Maps API, I was like, oh my God, this is so fun. And I was, just making stuff that I'd never even intended to make, right? One thing I made was, you guys know the traveling salesman problem, right? Classic problem, trying to figure out the optimal route for the salesman to visit all the places. We have a yearly activity at our college, which is the fountain run, where you have to go to every fountain on campus and take a shot and try to make it through every fountain. But there are 25 fountains on campus, and if you do the math, you basically never make it to the last fountain because your coordination dies. So I was like, all right, we really need to apply the traveling salesman problem to this because, we need to know the optimal route because we can't waste any time, right? We're getting drunker and drunker by the fountain. So one of the first Google Maps mashups I made was just doing a map of our fountains with photos of all of them and then figuring out the optimal routes via like Hamilton cycle minimization or something, and then showing them on the map, and then sharing that on Facebook. And I think people still use it to figure out the right route, right? But that's the kind of thing that I really didn't need to do, but it was really fun, and I liked it so much that I did it. So if you make your thing really, really good, people are going to use it for stuff beyond what you originally imagined, right? And that's kind of the point of putting something out there as a developer tool or API, is to put it in people's imaginations and see what they're going to do. Okay, so let's talk in more detail about developer experience, giving a couple different examples. So the first step, figuring out if you want to use something. So there you're kind of answering some questions yourself, right? So does it have the features I need? One way of knowing this is to look at the documentation. Hopefully, if it's documented, it actually exists. That's an assumption we make. Another way is if they actually have like an interactive playground or explorer, so you can try right there and see, does it work? Your other question is if you're actually building a business, is it safe to build a business on it, right? So licensing is really important when you're working with stuff like APIs because they've all got different licenses, like you're allowed to use this for free apps, or you're allowed to make money off this data, or this is what you can do with this data. And Twitter actually has a really nice, like plain English terms of service. Pretty much every other API has terms of service that are written by lawyers and are impossible to understand. And I know this because our Google Maps API terms of service was written by lawyers and nobody understood it, and I spent half my time trying to interpret it. So it's good to have these plain English ones here. And then there's pricing, right? Is it going to work for you? So they're like SendGrid, they've got all these different pricing levels, and especially now with APIs, you have some APIs that are doing like per transaction pricing. Some of them have this base cost and you get a certain amount. Some of them have a free plan. So if you're bootstrapping or something like that, pricing can really matter. And then there's stability, right? Does the API go up and down? How fast is it? How slow are the servers? And that's something that can often be hard to tell from the API site themselves, because most providers don't want to admit that they have a flaky API. A lot of providers now provide system status pages, so you can see that it's all up. But I wouldn't trust system status pages because sometimes those go down and they don't necessarily have the best data either. So stability is something you kind of have to feel out, ask around, check in the forum, see what people are saying, that sort of thing. Case studies can be really useful, right? Because case studies are basically, interviews with people that show this is how somebody used it, and they actually managed to build a business around it, right? So it proves that it has a certain set of features, and that was actually stable enough to build on. All right, so then how do you sign up? So the best answer is that you don't have to sign up. It just works. You can start using it immediately, right? Now, that's not always possible. Sometimes you have to require people to sign up for privacy reasons or tracking reasons. So if you do have to have people sign up, try not to have keys because they're just a bitch. And at least automate the key sign up, right? So that I can sign up immediately. I tried a few APIs in the last year where it's like you fill out a form and they're like, okay, we're going to email you in a few days with your API key. It's like, no, you don't understand. In a few days, I'll have already moved on to the next big thing, and I have completely forgotten about your API, right? Don't give people time to forget about the API. Give them what they want immediately. And then if you are going to force people to sign up and do the key thing and all that stuff, it's good that if there's actually like a dashboard that they can log in and see, right? So for Simple Geo, before they got killed, acquired, or whatever, they had this nice dashboard where you could see your queries and you could see errors and all that stuff, right? So if you make people go through this effort of sign up, at least hopefully we get something out of it. All right, so how do you get started? And this is basically, you know, the first thing you do with it, right? So you want to have downloads for every environment, for every language, right? If there's an HTTP API and you want to use that HTTP API, you go to the site and you're looking like, all right, my favorite language is Haskell. Where's the Haskell client library for this API? I don't know if those exist. But for me, it's always Python, and I'm always looking for the Python client library. So hopefully there's already a client library for the language you're looking for. If you use something like Eclipse and it's a Java thing, hopefully there's a plugin for it. So you're just looking for the easiest way of getting started in your environment, right? And then you look for the Hello World. Some people don't like Hello Worlds, but come on, you know, it's cool. Like, you get something going, it makes you happy. So like on PhoneGap, this is their Hello World, and it's nice they actually have a different Hello World for every platform, and you can just pick your platform, and then it goes through all the prerequisites, and then you actually get a mobile app working on your phone by the end of it. But once you get past the Hello World, you actually need to use it, right? Because there's something you actually set out to really do with it. So that's when you actually have to start digging into the documentation and seeing how do you do X. So there the documentation has to be really good. So it needs to be comprehensive. That means everything needs to be documented, right? I mean, when I say like, when in doubt, document, or like another way of saying it is just document the shit out of everything, right? There's nothing that shouldn't be documented. You might say like, well, it's kind of buggy that it works that way. Just tell people that, right? If you know something about the API, tell people. Why withhold that information? Why force a developer to sit there for 2 hours to figure out something that you already knew? So everything should be documented, right? Return, defaults, errors, bugs, deprecation, all of that stuff, right? You should have both, there should be a reference and a guide. So, you know, the reference is your straight API, and the guide is the human English form. Some people learn by reading human English. Some people learn by reading tables of methods. You need both. Even videos can be useful as well, right? Some people learn via videos. It's great if it includes runnable code. One of my favorite charting APIs, the HighCharts API, they've got a huge number of options, like hundreds of options, but for every single option, they link to multiple JS fiddles to show you that option running. So you can actually like just click on the option, and then it opens up the JS fiddle, and then you can actually play with that live. So you know before even going to your code whether that option does what you need it to do. So that's an amazing thing, and it makes you just so much more productive as a developer. The docs should be easy to navigate, right? Should be easy to go through different versions, go to the different methods, link in between different things. It should be easy to search, right? So having searching, you can find both within this, and you can also search across all the documentation here. But when I say easy to search, it doesn't mean just putting a search box on your page that works. You also need to make sure that Google can search it, right? Because a lot of people are going to Google when they're trying to find something, right? Most people aren't going directly to your site. At least for me, I always start at Google. And for a lot of people, though, for some reason, they forget about Google and checking that stuff. But SEO is important for developer API stuff, too. So you should always search and see, like, what happens? Can I actually find my stuff? Like, if your documentation is completely generated in JavaScript, it might not show up on Google, and that's going to suck. So people should be able to find stuff everywhere they search from. All right, so then once you start using it, do you actually enjoy using it? And so there where we get to API design, which is kind of a hard thing to do, right? The same thing as, like, you know, designing a website can be a little subjective. But there are definitely ways of doing better API design. So you want familiarity, simplicity, compatibility, debuggability. So for example, with an HTTP API, right? You should use standards when it makes sense to use them. Don't force something into a standard if it doesn't actually fit. But when it makes sense, use them, right? So REST, RPC, OAuth. Compatibility, like supporting multiple output formats like JSON and XML are both very popular now, and you should probably just support both. Simplicity, if you throttle, like if you return these errors every 10 calls that say you're going over the limit, that's really hard to develop around. So try not to do that. And debugging, right? Don't just give the same error message for everything that possibly goes wrong with the API. Give a little more info than that, right? You want to help the developer out, because then otherwise we're just going to go to the forum and say, I got error, tell me what it means, right? So if the API outputs meaningful error messages, then it's less, posting in the forum that you deal with. And just never use SOAP. My dad was a SOAP evangelist when I was a kid, and we don't really talk that much anymore. Okay, so then how do we get help? So there you need a forum, right? And if you have a forum, I mean, it seems like obvious stuff, all these things, but then when you actually start using stuff, you find that half of them are missing it, right? So in a forum, you want email subscription and feeds, you want stats and badges, you want spam handling. And some people roll their own things. I noticed that Jira has this Atlassian answers, and that looks pretty neat. It actually looks a lot like Stack Overflow. Some people use stuff like Google Groups, Stack Overflow. But yeah, you need some way of doing this, right? And once again, you want it all to be searchable. So if I go to Google, hopefully I can actually find all these questions and answers from Google as well, right? Think of Google as this massive knowledge base, and you want everything that's part of the documentation for something, and that includes forum stuff, to be in that massive knowledge base. And then there's an issue tracker, right? When something actually is a bug, people need to be able to report it. Okay, so far I've said, like, all right, you should have a good developer experience and you shouldn't have a shitty one. But I was thinking about it and realized that it's not really as simple as having a good one versus a shitty one. I realized there's actually kind of a curve, like a learning curve, an experience curve for a lot of these tools. So for some tools, you might actually start off and maybe it's kind of a bad experience, like maybe it's kind of hard, and maybe it's hard to wrap your head around what you're supposed to be doing. But then after you use it for a little bit, and then it gets more and more familiar, and then you start to understand, what it's doing, then you actually really, really like it. And then it just gets better and better and better. So I had this experience with Backbone the other day. Anyone use Backbone? So Backbone is a JavaScript MVC framework. And I'd actually never used an MVC framework at all before. So for me, it was my introduction to MVC frameworks. And it was also introduction to Backbone. And for me at first, it was really shitty. Like, I was literally like crying in the bathroom of my co-working space and going, I can't do it, I don't understand. But then I kept trying and I kept trying, and now that I get it, it's actually, I understand, I wrapped my head around the MVC thing, and now that I understand that, I can actually be more productive, and I'm actually having a good experience with it, right? So there's some things like MVC that maybe it's always will take a little time to learn, but once you do learn it, it's awesome, and you can keep having a good experience. There's some things, on the other hand, that start off easy and nice, and you're like, oh wow, I got my hello world going in 10 minutes, and that was so cool. But then you start to do something complex with it, and then it all breaks down, and you realize that the API doesn't really work there, and then they just basically, it's too hard to do what you actually want to do. So those are ones that start off positive and then just go negative, and they're basically just negative forever. So you definitely don't want that experience, right? And the holy grail would be something that's just always positive and you're just always having a good time with it. But it may not always be possible, right? It could be that, it actually does take some time to get to know something. But that's something to think about, is that it's not simply whether it's a good or a bad experience. It's an experience that changes over time as you're getting to know something. Okay, so looking at all this stuff, and you might be thinking, like, if you're a provider, like, all right, that's cool. How do I figure out what the experience is like for people using my product? So in that case, you really need to have a good feedback loop, right? So that means like a couple things, right? In the docs, you could have feedback forms. So this was on PhoneGap, and they had this little thing on the bottom that was just, how can we improve? And I think I sent like 20 different pieces of feedback in there, and I think then they shut off the form. So keep your form up. You could do surveys, right? I found a few examples of different surveys that people did. Something really interesting I did the other day was actually an API usability testing day, and this is the first I'd heard of an API usability day. So this was with AT&T, their mobile group, in collaboration with Sentia, and they just had like 10 of us in a room in Palo Alto, and it was really formal. It looked exactly like this, and we weren't even allowed to talk to each other because I went there with my boyfriend. I thought it'd be like a fun date, but we couldn't even talk to each other because they didn't want us to share answers and share knowledge. But we got like these envelopes full of tasks that we had to do, and we would have to open each task every few hours, and the task would be like, all right, you're going to use the API to do this, this, and this, and this. And then when you were done using it, the person would come over and interview you and videotape you talking about how much you hated doing it and what they need to change about the API. And it was really cool because there was the engineers there and the product managers and all these people. And so it was them finding out in this very rigorous, structured way all this stuff that they needed to fix about their API. And so that was basically a really extreme example of just doing a hackathon, right? A lot of people put on hackathons now, and they're very popular. And when a provider puts on a hackathon, it's actually a perfect excuse to see in the wild what it's like when people are using your API, right? So whenever we'd have a hackathon with the Google Maps API, I'd make sure that our documentation writers were there so they could see exactly where people would get confused in the docs and what their #1 questions were. So hackathon is just a lightweight version of a usability testing day, and it might even be a cheaper way of doing it. But you can't always just expect developers to come to you and give you the feedback, right? If you're a provider, you actually just need to be monitoring all the time for all the different places that people put their opinions out, right? Because this is like the age of the internet and all this stuff, so people put their opinions out everywhere, right? And they don't always give opinions to you. So people tweet all the time, right? Twitter is basically everyone's favorite place to rant. So there's lots of rants about APIs. So, if you just monitor for various APIs, like I just, found this one a few days ago, it's easy. If you've ever used the Facebook API, you know that an angel gets its wings for every point that stock drops. So if you monitor Twitter, you'll see lots of stuff. Same thing with blog posts, conference talks. Like there was this talk at recently that was real life lessons with PhoneGap. And it was basically like, all right, this is what the docs say, and this is what I actually experienced, right? And so for the PhoneGap guys, hopefully they're paying attention to that talk, because that's exactly what they need, the kind of feedback they need to be getting. And so when I was working on APIs, I just always had a Google alert set, so I would catch anything anyone was talking about anywhere. Okay, so, I really like makeovers and makeover shows. When I was a kid, I think I watched, Trading Places quite a bit. That was a makeover show, and What Not to Wear. So it is possible to make over an API or a developer tool if it's not good, right? So if you're watching all this and thinking like, oh, wow, I need to fix some stuff, don't worry, it's possible. You can go from that guy to that guy. Actually, I kind of like the guy on the left better. But for an example, right? So when I was on Google Maps API, we were working on V2 was basically the version, and that was the version we had for years and years, and it was really old, and it had a lot of problems. But they always say, it's dangerous to rewrite something, so we postponed rewriting it for as long as we could. But then when mobile browsers became popular, we realized we absolutely had to rewrite it in order to work well on mobile browsers. So we came out with V3, and V3 had a lot of improvements, right? The #1 was that there was no keys. But also in V2 we had a rather large download size for the JavaScript. And in V3, they rewrote it completely with an MVC architecture, and it meant that we only had to pass down the model, and then we could get the view later, and so that meant a much smaller download. V2, we had these really lame global variables, which were like capital G, MAP, and in V3, we used namespaces like real developers. In V2, we had these really Java-like JavaScript functions. And in V3, we embraced JavaScript and used options, object literals. So that was a really cool makeover, like 3 years in the making. It's not always a good idea to completely rewrite something from scratch. There's been a lot of articles about that. But you can just vastly improved documentation, because for a lot of these things, it just comes down to the documentation. Even if the tool is hard to use, if the docs are good and if the docs give you the information you need about working around issues, then you'll have a good experience. So Zepto.js, that's a JavaScript library that I use. If you're familiar with jQuery, it's like jQuery, but doesn't support IE old versions. So it means it's much more lightweight and works well on mobile. So they had these docs, and their doc originally was just a GitHub README, and this was literally their documentation, which was just a pre-tag with all their methods and comments that said what they did. So that was pretty shitty. So they just redid their documentation recently, and now they've got this nice page with code snippets inside of it. And the important thing is for every method, they actually specify how it differs from the jQuery method. And any other notes, like if it's actually not in jQuery at all, right? So it's really important for people that are used to jQuery and coming to Zepto. So this makes Zepto really much more usable, and you'll run into a lot less problems when using it. Okay, so now you've seen kind of what developer experience is and what it means to have a good one. So we have like half and half providers here. So if you guys are providers, then your next steps is to actually, well, the first step is to actually care, to give a shit. If you don't care, then it's probably not going to work, right? So you actually have to care about your developers. You have to like wake up in the middle of the night and be like, oh God, my developers, what are they feeling right now? I used to do that. And so you have to care about the experience, right? And then you have to figure out, well, what's wrong about our current experience and prioritize, right? Because there's probably a million different things that can be fixed about any one product in the world, right? Whether it's a developer product or user product. So you always have to prioritize. And then you just improve and you keep listening and improving and all that. Now for consumers, the other half of you, this talk may seem like it's all geared at providers, but there's actually a lot that you can do as consumers, right? Because I was talking about that feedback loop. Like people need feedback on their products, right? And they need to hear from you what's missing in the doc. So if you're using something and you realize that something is incorrect about the docs, but then you figure out the right way, don't just keep that knowledge to yourself. Like let people know, share that knowledge, right? So that the next person that comes along and has that same issue can find that you noted that as a bug somewhere, or maybe they'll find that now it's fixed because you actually reported it, right? So anything you find that's wrong with something you're using, report it, try and fix it if you can, right? Anytime you use an open source project on GitHub and you find an issue with it, try and fork it. Even if you're just forking the documentation. I am a contributor to quite a few projects on GitHub, but that's purely because I just go around and forking everybody's docs and like fixing their docs to be more clear, right? Because that's worth it, because people actually use documentation and it can make stuff that much better. So if you're using people's stuff, like give people's feedback, give people like useful feedback that they can actually use, let them know how they can actually improve it. And then when you do something awesome, tell them, because that's what makes their life happy. So basically that's a point that developer experience is actually a thing, and it's something that we should care about and talk about, because then maybe the more we talk about it, the better it'll get, and maybe eventually Facebook will actually be a fun API to work with. One day Facebook will be in the audience when I talk about this. And if you're interested in more information, there's developerexperience.org, and there's also developersupporthandbook.org, where I wrote up a lot of this in a lot more detail. So go out there, make something better. Thanks. Questions or? Cool. If anyone has questions. Oh, yeah. Okay, so the question is about the transition from Google Maps V2 to V3 and like how long that took. So, I mean, we started talking about that years before it happened. But it wasn't until the need for mobile that we actually took action on it. So rewriting the API from scratch didn't take too long once we figured out the architecture with MVC. So maybe that was like half a year. And then we started off with a trusted tester group. to try out the new stuff and give us feedback. It's always like trusted tester groups are great, but it's always a little tricky because you can't listen to their feedback too much. You always have to, anytime you're listening to feedback, you always have to take it, with a grain of salt, and don't make them think you're going to implement everything they ask for. So we had the trusted tester group for, I think, 3 or 4 months, and then went live with V3, and had that in a preview mode for like a year. So it's very key also to communicate the current status of an API, right? Its stability level, what people can expect in terms of, is it going to go down? How often is it going to change? So in Google, we spent a long time figuring out our versioning scheme and our messaging. So now on Google, there's actually like different levels. There's different status levels for APIs. So there's like preview, there's experimental, and then there's stable. And so that way, if you're using something in preview, you know that it actually can change. And if you're using something that's stable, I think the policy is like we have to give it like a year's notice or something if we make a backwards compatible change, right? So we spent a while on figuring out the versioning and avoiding backwards compatible changes and that stuff. So it's kind of a drawn out process in different stages. Anything else? Cool. Okay.
Thanks, Pamela. Yeah, the developer experience. Pamela gave this talk, about a year ago, in New Zealand, and a few of us at Atlassian saw this, and it struck a strong chord. It's really easy to build frameworks and APIs. It's a lot harder to build a good experience around it. And so, now as we build out new frameworks, update new frameworks, we're really thinking about how to factor in a good experience. So, thanks.